readers, welcome back to iWizard. Nikki here. So if you're curious about cozy fantasy and you've seen this image popping up everywhere, well, you've come to the right place, because today I'm going to talk about Legends and Lattes and its prequel, Bookshops Bonedust. So stay tuned. Every once in a while, a writer strikes the perfect chord and gives readers something that they didn't even know they wanted. And I believe Legends and Lattes is one of those books. It's branded as high fantasy with low stakes. So there's not much activation energy required to get into the book. There's not even a map. I mean, the story takes place essentially in one location, with the exception of the prologue. And there's not all kinds of crazy fantasy names. There's not a complex magic system that you need to keep a little notebook about. And as long as you're a lover of fantasy and you're familiar with like typical fantasy races like orcs and goblins and elves and dwarves and so forth, like you'll be totally fine with this. And I absolutely love Baldree's story that he shared in the acknowledgement section. And as a fantasy writer myself, I got kind of misty-eyed reading it. Like, it's just so lovely that if you put a book out there and readers come together and really appreciate it and love it and share it, that such great things can happen. So in February 2022, Baldree self-published Legends and Lattes on Amazon. And then by June 2022, this edition had come out published by Tor. And he did note that he believes a lot of that was due to the author Shannon McGuire kind of gushing about it on Twitter and sharing it. And it really doesn't hurt, like, just how perfect the cover art is for this book. Like, this is exactly the kind of feel that you get when you're reading it. And it's a really cute and creative idea. Our protagonist is Viv, and she's an orc. And so already, if you know anything about fantasy, right, you know how orcs are typically portrayed.
Fear. The city is ripe with it.
The prologue opens up just as such, where it's just this like violent, gory, gushing fight scene where she's killing this big monster, and she and her gang are pillaging the treasure from the monster. And by the end of it, she's just like, yeah, I'm sore. I'm done with this. I'm sick of always traveling around. I'm going to settle down. I'm going to retire. And Legends and Lattes is the story of her retirement. And what does she do? Viv moves to the city of Thun, and her plan is that she's going to sell coffee. She's going to open up a cafe. And the really sweet part about this is that population, all those different fantasy races, are unfamiliar with coffee. They've never encountered it before. So you experience them all encountering it for the first time. And there is something magical about this book. It's one of those books where you, for some reason, you just can't put it down. Okay, you devour it and you're just like, oh, just a little more, just a little more, just a little more, until like I read this pretty quickly. And that doesn't happen that often. So I spent a little time trying to put my finger on what that was. And of course, my mood when I read it didn't hurt, because it was around the holidays and I had all my festive lights on. I had my candles going. I was drinking my tea. And I also discovered during this time a wonderful YouTube channel, like my new favorite YouTube channel, and it's called Cozy Times. So if you love like stormy ambiance with like flickering fire and like cats and couches and books and everything, definitely check it out. So I had that playing in the background. So I'm like listening to a winter storm on my TV while there's a winter storm outside. So there's a lot of little factors that I think combine and play into that magic of this addictive read, right? Starting with the cover art, okay, that's just perfect. And it just like, this is how I definitely envisioned the characters. And then when you get into reading it, every single chapter has like this little icon underneath it, like, and it gives you an idea of what's coming up in that chapter. And so like with cozy fantasy, the whole idea is that you just feel safe and you know that in the end, nothing really bad's going to happen. So another thing that I think really helped its readability is that the writing is so smooth. And I think that's in large part due to the fact that Travis Baldree is also an audiobook narrator. And so he knows when things sound right. Okay, so there's nothing that you get caught up on. There's nothing that slows you down and takes you out of it. So it's very easy to stay caught up in the story. So the prose is evocative and does not get in its own way. And while this book is branded as low stakes, it's not really low stakes. And I think that is part of it. Like, yes, in terms of fantasy, it's low stakes in that Viv does not need to go out and save the world. There's not all these battles. There's none of that, okay? But compared to our typical unfantastical daily lives, okay, what's going on in this book is high stakes. Viv has spent her adult life, okay, working and going on these quests to get paid or find treasure. And she's put her whole self into that. Okay, so she has her life savings that she's taking with her to start her own business. And that is not low stakes in the slightest. So that is a high stakes venture that's relatable to us, okay? That like familiar fear of losing it all. She's pouring everything into this. And every single chapter, you're given a little bit more, okay? You accompany her on building her dream and realizing it a little bit at a time, right? She first has to procure the location and purchase it. And the whole time, like, she's an orc, she's intimidating. Everyone is like, kind of like a little like wary and afraid of her. And then she starts to collect her workers, right? She hires Cal, the hob, who's like her construction worker. And then he tries coffee the first time, and it's really cute that he refers to it as bean water. It's all like these like really quaint details. Like she hires a succubus named Tandri, who you see on the cover here. And then they hire a baker who's a ratkin named Thimble. And each thing that happens is not like shocking. It's not earth shattering, but it's like just enough to keep you reading. And it's just like these little things, okay? Like just watching the menu grow, and it's like, oh, now they have cinnamon rolls, and oh, now they have biscotti. And it's like, okay, they're all things that we're familiar with, but for some reason, I just couldn't put it down. And I was just like, oh, just a little more, like eating some delicious dessert that you're full of, but you can't stop yourself because it's so delicious. And I feel like that's what this book was the entire time. So if you're someone who loves like luxurious, like coffee and dessert descriptions, then maybe this is something for you. I mean, personally, like seriously, the one thing I really didn't like about this book is it kind of made me hungry while I was reading it. And still, like, while like the overall plot is just really the growth of the cafe that's called Legends and Lattes, there's still more going on. There's conflict. There's some like thugs that are trying to get payments from different businesses to offer them like protection, like the mafia, you know. And there's also a bigger fantasy element in that the monster that Viv defeated in the beginning is called a Scalver, and she stole its stone from it, and there's some magical properties to the stone. It does some things, and so some people come in who are looking for it. And so there is magic to it. There is some conflict. There is struggle. There is a little bit of battle, but it's not a lot. It's just a taste of it. So really the story is about building community, right? Finding your family, finding where you belong and fit in. And it's so wholesome. And even the customers become familiar to you, and all the characters have their own little memorable quirks. And Viv has had a colorful past, and this is her journey of like reinventing herself and changing her ways and ultimately learning that she doesn't have to let go of or completely forget what she's done in the past because it's part of who she is. And she could be accepted for that. Okay, you do not have to forget your past. And I will admit there's also some nostalgia to this for me because when I graduated my undergrad in engineering, I went on to still be a full-time student in physics. So I had to get a part-time job. And so I couldn't get an engineering job. So I worked in food service. So I waitressed and bartended and was a barista. I was a grill and fry cook. I did all the things. But there are some moments that are just so peaceful and so reflective that I actually did see in Viv in Legends and Lattes. So maybe there was a little bit of that nostalgia there for me as well. So maybe you're to the point in your fantasy reading journey where you just want a side quest. And as Baldree puts it, it's for anyone who ever wondered where the other road led. It's delicious, it's cozy, and as soon as I finished, I was like ready for the next one. I was ready for the prequel. The prequel is set a couple decades before Legends and Lattes, and just keep in mind that by the time I got to the prequel, maybe I was a little bit full off Legends and Lattes because I did not devour it in the same way. Okay, so Bookshops Bonedust was published in November 2023, so super, super recently. And really, it was designed in the same mold as Legends and Lattes in that we're with Viv again. So if you love Viv and you want more Viv, you've got her. And she's a much younger Viv. So the prologue is her first adventure. Okay, and on this mission, she is battling a necromancer and her wights like WIGHTS, like zombies. And she gets injured. She injures her leg and she has to go recover in a nearby town. And it's this sleepy seaside village aptly named Merk. And there's not much to do there. Essentially, there's the Perch, which is the place she's staying at. There's Thistlebur Booksellers and Seasong Bakery. Okay, so you can imagine, okay, there's going to be some more baked goods descriptions because we all love that. So you're with Viv while she's making friends in the community. She makes friends with this ratkin who owns the bookshop. Her name is Fern. I'm pretty sure Fern has Tourette's. And Fern has this little cute Griffith pet named Pot Roast. There's this dwarf that she meets named Melee who runs the bakery. And then also there's a gnome who is yearning for adventure and yearning to become part of someone's crew. She's great with knights, but she's just this tiny gnome, so no one takes her seriously, named Galena. And you might recognize the name Galena from Legends and Lattes because she does end up becoming part of Viv's crew. So they've been friends for like 22 years by the time you get to Legends and Lattes. And also in this book, you get the story of how Viv acquired her sword, Black Blood. Okay, so I would definitely recommend reading Legends and Lattes before you read Bookshops Bonedust, even though this is the prequel, because I think you'll just appreciate it more because you'll have some of that familiarity, like, oh, that's where that came from. So I think the writing was on par in Bookshops Bonedust with Legends and Lattes. It was possibly even a little bit better. And it was quite energetic in that in the bookshop, there are all these like fictional works that are, it's like metafiction, right? Because it's fiction to that world, but it's also fiction to our world, okay? So Baldree writes like all these little excerpts that he shares from these different books, and during the story, Viv discovers her love of reading because she really has not much else she can do. And she also starts helping out Fern in the bookshop, and because the bookshop is kind of in trouble. She's been struggling. And so she kind of helps her turn it around, get more customers, reinvent the shop, and so forth. But I think why this wasn't as addictive, why this wasn't as much of a page turner as the first book, is because the stakes were actually a lot lower, right? Because it's just Viv helping out at a bookshop. It's not her bookshop. It's not her livelihood. By definition, it's much lower stakes, even though maybe like the fantasy element, so that like fantasy conflict part of the story arc was a little more intense here, and that there's like this necromancer kind of looming and that becomes part of the story and so forth. But really that's kind of mostly in the background here. And what I really did, one of the things I loved most about this book, honestly, was I really did like how So the epilogue brings you back to the time of Legends and Lattes, and it does tie in and maybe sets up for a third book. Okay, so that was done really well. Like all in all, it was enjoyable, but I think I kind of had my fill personally by the end of Legends and Lattes. And then at the same time that I was reading Bookshops and Bonedust, like bizarrely, Jordan had convinced me to read John Grisham's Camino Island. And you might think, what does this have to do with anything? Oh my God, it's actually kind of so similar to Bookshops and Bonedust, but like in a really strange way. I guess if you blur your eyes to Bookshops and Bonedust. Okay, so they both take place around bookshops in seaside locations. Okay, so in Camino Island, the story is set up around the heist of F. Scott Fitzgerald's original manuscripts from the Firestone Library at Princeton. Okay, and then like what happened to those manuscripts, who ended up buying them, and so forth. And so we have our main characters. We have Bruce Cable, who runs the bookshop, and he deals in rare books. And then we have Mercer, who's an adjunct professor and a published writer who hasn't really finished a book in a while, who goes into work undercover. Okay, so because her, I believe it was her grandmother had a house on Camino Island, so she kind of had the perfect cover story to go there. So we have stolen manuscripts in Camino Island. And then in Bookshops and Bonedust, okay, we have the Necromancer's Black Book that Viv and Fern end up getting their hands on. But really what kind of surprised me is that even though Grisham's writing is not nearly as sensory as Baldree's, is that like, I found that Grisham did a really nice job like romanticizing books, okay? Almost even more than was done in Legends and Lattes. And the reason I think that is that in Camino Island, it's real books that I was familiar with, right? Special editions of real authors that we read. Whereas in Legends and Lattes, it's like the books are metafiction, right? So it's not anything that we're even familiar with. So maybe it was a little bit of that. But anyway, the characters in Legends and Lattes definitely have, the characters in Bookshops and Bonedust and Legends and Lattes definitely have more heart. Grisham's main characters in Cable and Mercer are quite flawed to the point where it's like, these are not very good people that I can really identify with. So it's like you start to like maybe not care as much what happens to them. And the ending was a little bit abrupt. But anyway, that's just a side note. But if you want to read like a thriller that's kind of similar in feel to Bookshops and Bonedust, in that it's like this sleepy seaside town in which everyone knows each other, and there's a bunch of writers, and there's lots of romanticizing of books and bookshops and so forth, then maybe you pick that up, just putting her out there. But seriously, if you just want to swaddle up in a blanket with a nice warm beverage with some maybe cozy times playing in the background, light some candles and so forth, and you want some fantasy that won't be a huge commitment, that won't be frustrating, that'll just be like a fun read, now might be the time. That's it. Next up, for me, I've been planning this for quite a while now, and for quite a while, it's like I've been wanting to do this for like a year and a half now, is that I have been rereading Dracula, and I just read Paula Dory's Vampire, and I'm planning on putting out some vampire content where I'm going to go through the history and the lore of the vampire. So stay tuned for that, and I'll see you next time. Bye!